Tonight's topic is Australia at war again, the real reason why we are at war in the Middle East. And the speakers tonight are Richard Bronowski, President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the former Ambassador for Vietnam, Korea and Mexico. He's the author of 4 books, the latest being The Fallout from Fukushima.
I'm glad I let Jake go first. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. He gave an essentially academic analysis of the situation, and I couldn't agree with what he said more. I think he put it very well. I'm going to give a practical history lesson of why we are, again, for the 4th time, in the Middle East, in a war. I think we have to bear in mind what's happening here. John Key, the New Zealand Prime Minister, has announced I think 100 or 200 troops are going into Iraq, and our own Prime Minister Tony Abbott is going across to Wellington tomorrow to announce, I think, another 400 troops from Australia to join the 200 special forces who are already there. So this is going to escalate, and it's one thing they have said in the Liberal Conservative government in Australia is that there's no easy end to this. It's going to go on for a long time, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to make the point first that let's remember the reason we're there is because the Americans are there. If they weren't there, we wouldn't be there. Tony Abbott said in his braggadocio, pugilistic manner that he picked up at Oxford that he's going to send 3,500 troops into Iraq to teach these buggers a lesson. ISIL a lesson. And before that he'd been speculated as saying that he would send another 1,000 troops to encircle MH17 in the Ukraine to stop those pro-Russian people coming in and despoliating the area and doing all sorts of manner of evil to the Australians and the others who died there. His colleagues, and I think he, have strenuously denounced that this happened, but it's from very persistent journalistic sources that this comes, and I think there must be some truth in it. But when you look at the history, I mean, go back before Federation, the Crimea, go back to the Sudan, go back to the Boxer Rebellion and the Boer War. The Boer War broke out, the Second Boer War, in 1898. We weren't yet federated, and yet every province was asked by Britain, by the Colonial Office, that this young lady Mary comes from, to send forces, and we didn't at first. Uncharacteristically, we decided not to go and help mother country because we wanted to command our troops, and so there was a good deal of friction. And also the Catholic Church and the Irish were dead against doing it. But when Federation was taking place in 1901, we were at war in South Africa, not on our own behalf, but on behalf of Mother Britain, against the Boers. And it was the most unpopular war, actually. But leading on from there, the First World War, you know the troops, the Anzacs, who went to Egypt for training in 1915, March 1915, they didn't know where they were going. They thought they were going to the Western Front. And halfway across to Egypt, they were told, oh no, you're going to Egypt for further training. And they didn't know for some time that they were in fact going into a Winston Churchill phantasmagorical war to invade Germany through the soft underbelly of the Turkish Empire, up the Dardanelles, take Istanbul, Constantinople, and then move on and help our Russian brethren. They didn't know this, and they didn't care. They didn't seem to want to know, because the Governor-General, just before the British decided to actually go into the war against Germany and declare war in 1914, said, we will give you 20,000 troops, the British Governor-General in Australia, will give you 20,000 troops to do with what you want, and we'll assign our navy to you to do with it, to send where you want as well. So we deserve the sort of contemptuous treatment we got from the Brits, I think. And I think the Australians who went to Gallipoli, just as surprised as anyone else, that that's where they, along with French, Indian and some other British troops, we always ignore the other countries involved, went as well. That was a bloodbath. Second World War, same thing. Except in the Second World War, ladies and gentlemen, for once, we did declare war against Japan. Menzies took us to war against Germany. He said sonorously that that Poland has been invaded by Germany, the ultimatum has come to an end, Britain is at war, therefore Australia is at war. But in 1941, Curtin was so exercised about Japan attacking Pearl Harbor and coming down to Malaya and threatening Singapore that he said, he had a debate, uncharacteristically, a debate in Parliament, and the executive decided to declare war against Japan before the British did. So, it's a first for us that we did that. Because that was the only war in which Australia itself was threatened by Japan. None of the others were in that category. Against the British, or with the British, it was a British war. And from then on, from the Second War on, it was on behalf of and as part of a force to pay our prudential dues to the United States under the ANZUS Treaty that we hoped to hell they'd defend us with. It was developed in 1952. And that was developed because we went into Korea ahead of any other United Nations force, because we had number 77 Squadron in Japan, occupied Japan, and we had 3 battalions there too, and they were the first troops that went in on the ground to help the South Koreans and the beleaguered Americans. But again, that was simply to have our credentials with America recognised as an ally worth supporting. The Malayan Emergency, which took place before the Korean War, 1948 it began, Korea began in 1950, was the same deal on behalf of the British. But the Vietnam War that occurred after Korea was solidly on behalf of the United States. We wanted some sort of independence, and we got it by having our own province to administer and look after Fort Cree province. But in fact, it was an American war, and we were there. We dragged our feet. We were quite disingenuous. On the one hand, we said, Menzies said, and Arthur Corwell convincingly fought against him in Parliament, but it didn't work. Menzies said that this is a war we have to win because it's the downward thrust of communist China between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, and we have to be there. Remember, this was the Cold War, but Menzies won every election he fought on the grounds of convincing and fooling the Australian people that Arthur Corwell and the Labor Party were soft on communists, and many of them were fellow trappers. It was a disgrace, but that's what happened. Vietnam dragged on. It was a disgrace. And then let's come to the Middle East. Now, it's not just one war we're fighting now, this so-called exercise, inherent resolve. I had to look up the word inherent and what it meant in this context. It's very interesting, but inherent resolve. But let's go back to 1991, when we joined the Americans. Bob Hawke couldn't wait to get into the war in 1991 to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And the Iraqis had invaded Kuwait because Donald Rumsfeld had told Saddam Hussein, look, we wouldn't stand in your way. If you want to take over Kuwait, go ahead. It was a kind of a provocation, but when they did, they were hit over the head. Then, of course, in 2001, we had the towers, the world towers collapse, and they were attacked, and Bush had to go in and seek revenge in Afghanistan. There's 17 of the 21 people involved were from Saudi Arabia, but nevertheless, he had to extract vengeance, and he did against Al-Qaeda, Operation Slipper, Sink the Slipper. And we joined that, and then when he couldn't find too many Al-Qaeda, certainly couldn't find the perpetrators, he turned his forces on the Taliban. And the Taliban became, I think, they had been a kind of a more or less ally in certain other stoushes, but they weren't then, and that convinced them against us. So then we move on from there, and we come to the invasion of Iraq in 2002, which was the most, I think, the reason why we got so much disquiet isn't just the spring arising of Arab Muslims in many Arab countries. It was also that Saddam Hussein had kept his lid on sectarian violence. Fairly authoritarian bloke he was too, but no more authoritarian than many leaders in many countries, especially in Central America, that the Americans had supported. But he kept the lid on that, and when the Americans invaded and took over and trashed the country, sectarianism was allowed like the genie out of the bottle. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons, in my view, my amateur view. I'm not I've been posted in Tehran, but as a diplomat I haven't been in these other Arab countries. But this is the reason why, in my view, there's been such a lot of sectarian violence since. It developed from that, and it's developed ever since. And so we come to 2014, the unexpected rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or Iraq and Syria. This was not really unexpected to Arabists, but it was to everyone else. It's a toxic metastasis of Sunni into a very virulent form, Sunni not Shia, and it's involved, it began in Libya, but it spread into Syria, and Syria, they've made a professional job of it. ISIL now controls about 40% of Syria, including the oil fields and the gas fields, and they have money. And they're spending that money on a very sophisticated nation-building campaign to declare to the world that they have a caliphate. And now they're moving, of course, into Iraq. So what does America do? They've been war-weary and shell-shocked and wanted to get out after their ill-begotten occupation of Iraq. Paul Bremer, who was a civil administrator there, one of the biggest mistakes he made was to disband the Iraqi army when the Americans invaded. And this meant that these well-trained, or reasonably well-trained men were now on the street without a job, without a uniform, without any hope. And they lost all credibility and they lost all morale. So now the Americans are back there trying to frantically do something about restoring them. And I think it's a very tough job. And what we're doing is what we did in Vietnam. We went into Vietnam in 1962 with an Australian Army Training Corps. And they were to train Vietnamese to fight the Viet Cong and to fight the North Vietnamese. We had a few Vietnamese speakers, but not many. And I suppose we taught them certain perspectives about Australian jungle warfare, but whether they listened or not is not very clear, because the fact was that if you've got a rotten government that's backing you in Saigon, it doesn't matter how good your troops or how good the morale or how good the training, it's going to collapse. Our soldiers, you have to give them respect. They were doing a job that they believed in. We had medical and dental and engineers and all sorts of corps working around Phuoc Tuy province, and they said, look, we're doing a great job, and these people are, you know, they really see the problems and they'd like to resist the communist aggression. That's all very well, but if you've got a rotten, corrupt government in Saigon, it's going to collapse anyway. Same thing in Afghanistan. It's exactly what's happened there. We had good morale among the soldiers we had there for some time, and they did some good things. They stopped women getting raped in the province they were working at. They encouraged and guarded young girls going to school. They did all sorts of things that were progressive. But then you've got a rotten government in Kabul that's not going to allow this thing to develop. Now this is what's happened in Iraq, and where do we go from here? I have to say, let's get a pen picture of what's happening. It's not just Australia supporting America. When I began to put my mind on what I was going to say tonight, I had to do a bit of research, and it really is a big movement that's going on in Iraq now against ISIL. You've got about 20 countries involved there, most of them Western countries, many of them carrying out bombing runs on behalf of and with the United States, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, US and UK of course, and Jordan and Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates. They're fighting against ISIL. In Syria, you've got Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates fighting on behalf of the Alawite government in Syria. Local forces in Iraq fighting with, or not allied to, but trying also to contain and destroy ISIL. You've got the Iraqi government forces, such as they are. Then you've got the Shia militias. You've got, forgive my Arabic, I don't speak it, Saib al-Haq, Badr Organisation, Kataib, Hezbollah, the Promised Day Brigade, Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurds are there, of course, they're fighting against ISIL as well. The Nineveh Plain Protection Unit, I like that. I don't know what it is, but there it is. They're all there, and they're all working. Some of them are fighting allies, some of them are fighting enemies. I mean, who would have thought that Iranian forces, Hezbollah, would be working almost alongside the United States and Australia to destroy ISIL, but they are. It's a very interesting situation we have, but it's not going to end soon, and there's no exit strategy. But don't be too afraid of the diggers out there, because I'll tell you what they're living in. And we found this out not from the Abbott government, who is being remarkably secretive about casualties, about tactics, about whether there's an exit strategy, about casualties on the other side from the bombing runs, the collateral strikes. They're not saying anything about this. Abbott won't have any Australian journalists go with him when he makes, and he has made several visits to Iraq to visit the Australian diggers. But one thing that staggers me is that the Americans replicate American standards of living in whatever country they move into. I recall very well in Japan going to American bases at Sasebo and Yokosuka. I remember being in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and going to American bases and seeing the enormous materialistic wealth that they have in those bases. But look, this is where Australian forces, courtesy of General Martin Dempsey, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, the most senior American soldier who's just been out here, he told us, Abbott didn't, the Abbott government, he told us that the Australian forces are basically, Australian Special Forces are at Anbar province in a specially secured base within a larger base called the Al-Assad base in this province. It's one of the largest US bases in Iraq. It's the Western equivalent to the Baghdad Green Zone. And the faculties, listen to this, the faculties in this base include, for the use of the Australians and the Americans who are there, gymnasiums, the largest PX department stores in the whole of the Middle East, Burger King, KFC, Pizza Hut, Subway restaurant, Green Beans coffee shop, combat support hospital, and a reverse osmosis water purification plant. They're self-contained, but you know this province is where ISIL is coming in and they're coming around it. What are the Australians doing? Well, they're not going beyond the wire, that's for sure. What they're doing is training Iraqi soldiers within this base. Now, I've often been a bit cynical about why do we condescend to think that we can train foreign forces when we don't speak their language? They've probably seen more fighting than we have. They're using weapons that, you know, are just as sophisticated as what we're using. How the hell can we train them? What can we do? But it's the white man colonial bird mentality, I think, that we see there. And there's another base where we're based in Dubai. There's a dusty airstrip, and Australia has a kangaroo, what they call a kangaroo base down at the end of it. Now that base is linked to other bases around the region, and of all these countries I mentioned, probably Australia has probably the most permanent network of bases for the Army, the Navy and the Air Force in the Middle East. And one of the reasons we're there is because we're there. You know, we're there because we're there. We've got these bases, they must be used for something. The soldiers and the airmen and the sailors who are there are getting tax-free allowances and danger money. They're quite happy to be there. They get rotated and they have certain traumas when they come home, but that's where they are. So this is the kind of environment in which Australians are operating right now. I want to say that, how long? 5 minutes? Good. I want to say that Abbott has done a very poor job, but we have an opposition. Yes, I'm sorry to say it. I know many of you don't agree. You don't agree with that, I know that. And Bill Shorten, of course. I mean, do we watch Shane McAuliffe and his zingers?
Absolutely.
Zingers? I wish we had a more charismatic opposition leader, and I wish Labor were less quiescent about what's happening, because what is happening is that the executive is continuing to declare war in all these cases without there being any kind of parliamentary debate. And parliamentarians are your representatives, and yet they're not given a chance to speak. It's always been the case since George III. The executive has declared war and peace, and that's what they're doing now, and the legislature has no say in the matter. And I belong to an organisation of which Malcolm Fraser is our patron and Paul Barrett, a former Secretary of Defence, is our main spokesman, that is trying very hard to encourage parliamentarians themselves to say, hey, we're going to stand up and be counted. We're going to have parliamentary debates before we go into war again. But it hasn't happened. Abbott's certainly not the one to do it. Whether Turnbull, I don't know how many of you saw it on Q&A the other night. Yes. He looked like a cat that swallowed the canary. He didn't say much, but God, he looked smug. And I think he's going to take over.
Ides of March.
Ides of March, that's right. So, just to finish, I want to quote from my friend and colleague Mungo McCallum, who, if I can find him, sorry about this. Yeah, Mungo McCallum recently observed that we have to subordinate our moral outrage, and there is a degree of moral outrage. It's not just being America's toady. We also feel sickened by what ISIL has been doing. It is a menace. We have to admit that, at least I certainly think it is. But God, it's a problem for the Islamicists to sort out amongst themselves. It's for the Arab countries to sort out, not for white colonial troops to go in and bomb the shit out of them and expect them to behave. They're not going to do that. Anyway, Mungo McCallum recently observed, we have to subordinate our moral outrage to the longer-term national interest. Otherwise, we'll be fighting never-ending wars against everybody, like in George Orwell's dystopian satire 1984. So ISIL beheads people, so does Saudi Arabia. ISIL abuses human rights, so does China. ISIL kills civilians, so does Israel. ISIL has a culture of violence, so does the United States. And ISIL indulges in terror, so did the IRA, and so too do many other states today. It's not a one-way street. It's not something that we can be, with any moral justification, be selectively indignant about. But that's what we've been. Meanwhile, we've been, like mushrooms, kept in the dark and fed bullshit. We're not told what the end result will be, what the exit strategy will be, what the collateral damage will be, or has been, how many missions there have been by F-18 strike fighters. There have been a lot. One thing I can say, though, is that I do understand, and I've got this from good authority, that Australian pilots, unlike their American counterparts, can abort an operation if they feel they might be going to create collateral damage and hit civilians. I like to think that might be true, but we have to wait to see. It's endless war without peace. I can't see an exit strategy myself, and I can see the professionalisation of the Australian Armed Forces in lockstep with what the Americans are doing. It's no longer G.I. Joe coming home and getting demobbed and going back to his village and his girlfriend and his mother's apple pie. Now you've got a professional force. John Batchovich, an American former general and someone who knows about this and has written books about it very compellingly, makes the point that the professional army is now above and beyond the civil population. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we've got in Iraq and Australia right now. Thank you very much.
Wow.